Alright, everyone, so it's Gilmore Girls season. It's been over 20 years since the show's debut season, but particularly as the weather gets colder, Gilmore Girls is one of the most rewatched, iconic comfort shows out there. I mean, nothing says cozy night in like some lazy takeout and a trip to Stars Hollow. This time of year, the internet is swarming with Gilmore Girls fandom tributes, from recipes imitating Luke's pumpkin pancakes to imitation Lorelai outfits. The wonderland of this show still inspires ritualistic rewatches and a comforting collective imagination. And that's because Gilmore Girls is a show with a profoundly robust identity. From the get-go, it knew exactly what it was. It seems weird to say for a mild-mannered show about a mother-daughter pair in a sleepy town in Connecticut, but Gilmore Girls is brimming with artistic confidence that defines every corner of its universe. From its dreamy love interests to hyper-romanticized pizza nights, from the elaborate themed parties to routinely nonsensical town meetings, this show was always obsessed with its own flavor in a very effective way. It's no accident that the idea of Gilmore Girls is attached to the idea of autumn, cozy sweaters, hot coffee, whatever. These aren't just shallow associations that gloss over the heart of the show, they are the heart of the show. So it stands to reason that so much fanfare around Gilmore Girls focuses on those cozy attributes. Rory-themed reading lists, Lorelai-themed playlists, weekly recap podcasts, quizzes about which boyfriend you should marry, and that's all fun. That's all part of that Gilmore Girls experience. But in terms of the more in-depth analysis, most of the retrospective discourse focuses on the material fallibilities of the show. Over the years, more and more fans have realized problems with, for example, the way the show depicts a single-parent working-class lifestyle as if it could afford takeout twice a day, or how the representation of Korean American culture, which is thoughtful at times, does stray into the cartoonish. How food and eating are treated, how the feminism is selective to the protagonists only and often involves pushing other women down, and, of course, how annoying, if not altogether insufferable, Rory becomes as she gets older. It's pretty fair altogether to say that this show embodies one particular privileged white girl fantasy world, and while there is some good in how, for example, Suki's weight is never a punchline or even a plot point at all, while it's definitely a small victory to have a show that centers any female experience, even if it's an unduly narrow one, I think the vast majority of these criticisms are critically important, and I've left a few links in the description here. But I've been wondering how, in spite of all these flaws, this show has maintained its comfort watch status, and that's what this video will address. Gilmore Girls isn't just a world of privileged escapism. This show actually has a distinct and unique approach to storytelling that certainly has some flaws, but also makes the watching experience enchanting, comforting, and persuasive even 2 decades later. As a quick reminder before we get rolling, Gilmore Girls focuses on the mother-daughter duo of Lorelai and Rory Gilmore. Though the show takes place in one cohesive chronological timeline, the past is just as relevant as the present here. At the start of the show, Rory is just 15, 1 year younger than Lorelai was when she had Rory. As a pregnant teen, Lorelai had left her stiff upper-class life in Hartford behind to work for a living and raise Rory alone. Now, these two are best friends, living in an idyllic small town in Connecticut called Stars Hollow, but everything changes when Rory is accepted to Chilton, a schmancy prep school that Lorelai can't afford, leading her to go back to her parents, Emily and Richard, for financial support. They acquiesce on the condition that Lorelai and Rory come over for dinner every Friday night, and though Lorelai can barely stomach the idea, she prioritizes her daughter's education, and off we go. From there, Lorelai and Rory navigate school bullies, crushes, boyfriends, best friends, work life, and more. It's a fantastic premise right off the bat, and we haven't even gotten into the eccentric supporting characters, trademark quick-paced dialogue, pop culture references, or any of the myriad ways the show casts its spell, and there's already a great plot hook. Though we start with a new beginning, we're really thrown into the middle of a story, as Lorelai has to face her past while building a future for herself and her daughter. In many ways, and despite its very narrow scope, Gilmore Girls presents the ultimate coming-of-age story because by centering both Rory and Lorelai as protagonists, every first for Rory, first kiss, first high school test, first breakup, is also happening to her mother.
I'm ready to wallow now.
These two complement each other, where Rory is studious, reserved, sort of awkward. Lorelai is outgoing, charismatic, and full of life wisdom. So one reason why so many young viewers, including myself when I first watched, one reason why the show is so comforting is how the show processes life milestones in a definitive way through Lorelai's guidance. This is how you deal with a breakup. This is how you ask a guy out. This is how you should feel on your wedding night. This is what graduating feels like. And in this way, Gilmore Girls is like a safe little guidebook to the objectively mundane but subjectively momentous passages of life. So the answer to why this show is so well beloved despite its substantial flaws isn't just cozy vibes. There are interesting and compelling storytelling mechanisms at work here, and this video will look at 4 of them: the story world, points of intersection and parallelism, narrative stakes, and neutrality. As we'll see, the Gilmore Girls' approach to storytelling has its pros and cons, but even the downsides help make the show as eminently rewatchable as it is. And finally, to note before we jump in, the show had 7 seasons, but due to creative and professional differences, the original showrunners, Amy Sherman Palladino and her husband Dan Palladino, left before the final season. And as such, it's not only of sort of lesser quality, but also just slightly strange. So in assessing character arcs and show meaning, I've tried to factor that in and not just dump on decisions made in that last season. Amy did return, however, for A Year in the Life, a 4-part sequel reboot that I am fully, 100% absolutely ignoring here, in part because it's its own project, but also because it sucked. It just sucked. So, spoilers ahead for the main runtime of the show, and if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. If you're already a subscriber, welcome back. Sorry it's been a while. Gilmore Girls takes place in the real world, yes, but if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll have already heard me say that the way any TV show chooses to cast its version of reality inherently creates a story world. A world that typically has its own rules, customs, and rhythms. It doesn't matter if it's high fantasy or a silly sitcom. So, for our purposes, the fictional town of Stars Hollow may as well be Narnia. Criticisms I mentioned earlier address the show's relationship to reality, which we're sorta disregarding here. And the actual setting is just one factor of a story world, but it's a big one for Gilmore Girls, as illustrated by a quick comparison to a more recent show, The Summer I Turned Pretty, which is predicated on the idea that these two families go to the same vacation house together every summer, but that show makes little to no effort into making its world special. Instead, a narrator has to tell us, this place is special, this house is the best. You should never have to tell the audience those things. We should feel it just from watching. And boy oh boy do we have that here. So Stars Hollow, Connecticut has its own rules. There's nowhere on Earth where you'd have time for a full diner breakfast before school and work every day, but you do in Stars Hollow. This town is utterly immune from events in the rest of the world, so besides technology accuracy, this show could take place at any time in history. The town is big enough for multiple cafes, restaurants, a local government, but small enough that you can walk anywhere and know everyone somehow. Neighbors just show up at your door, everyone gossips, everyone cares about what happens in the town, and most importantly, everyone loves Rory.
You blew up balloons for me?
Yep.
Aw, Luke, you old softy.
I count to 3, it's gone.
Thank you.
If you can't accept those rules of the world, you can't really watch the show, but if you do accept, you can feel like you live there. There are also plenty of details that are recurrent but invisible. For example, we hear several times that the best Chinese food in Stars Hollow is from a place called Al's Pancake World. We never meet Al, we never see the place, it never actually matters, but by making the audience privy to those consistent background details, the show makes us feel like we're part of the town. We know the in-jokes, the patterns, and the routines, and we know the people. So Gilmore Girls has a handful of supporting characters like Richard and Emily, Luke, Suki, Lane, Paris, and they each have their own little stories and they help co-create the central plots. But we also have a large cast of background characters that very rarely impact anything, so they're not really supportive, but they also feel utterly indispensable. It's hard to imagine Gilmore Girls without Miss Patty or Michelle or Kirk, these characters are handy in the writer's toolbox as they can cause little issues here and there, they can come in and out of focus, but more importantly, they create a consistent atmosphere and rhythm for each episode. Unlike a ruthlessly efficient show like The Bear, where every scene moves multiple things at once, Gilmore Girls actually takes a stunningly inefficient approach to story pacing. And so every episode makes time for these background characters to have their own little shenanigans, or even these little mini mood-setting vignettes. Imagine an episode where all of that is cut and we only really see the central plot with Rory and Lorelai, and everything would mostly be the same plot-wise, but it wouldn't feel like Gilmore Girls at all. And routine is a huge element here, not just in that rhythm of every episode, but to the story itself. On a weekly basis, we have a feel for the main routine: coffee, Pop-Tarts, Luke's, bus, school, work, more Luke's. And this goes slightly awry when Rory goes to Yale, but the show does its best to preserve that same flow. This is all angled at inviting the audience in, so we don't need to be told that it's strange if Lorelai skips her coffee. We're already intimately part of her routine. Crucially, then, when new characters arrive, they're disruptive to us as well, and we're part of the insider community.
Their eating habits are just the start of what you're gonna have to get used to. There's tons of stuff you should be aware of.
Vulture magazine tallied up some numbers for us, so we know throughout the main runtime there were 14 Stars Hollow festivals, 48 Stars Hollow businesses mentioned, 71 Friday night dinner scenes, 503 cups of coffee for Lorelai and Rory. Repetition, routine, rhythm, these are the bedrocks of the Gilmore Girls world and the main way at making the audience feel comfortable as part of it. And on those Stars Hollow festivals, so in Stars Hollow there are all these silly small town events that supposedly happen every year, but we only ever see once. For example, we hear Lorelai describe what happens every year at the 24-hour dance marathon. It's a big deal, it's a big episode, and of course, we never see another marathon again.
4 years in a row. I have come this close to winning last year. I swear to God I had it.
I know the story.
It's tradition.
I don't believe this.
It's true. My mother and I have been doing this every year since we moved here.
So why bother emphasizing it as annual? Why create what's really just a needless little plot hole? Well, this demonstrates emphasis on story world over plot sense. We need to be thrown into a place with tradition for the cozy effect to work. Like, no matter what happens, this town will always be out there doing its silly little parties, and we're invited anytime we want. They try to recreate this idea at Yale by introducing the Life and Death Brigade, an elite secret society that Rory becomes privy to through Logan. This club gives the show some latitude to have utterly fanciful episodes that, again, are repeatedly referred to as traditional, annual, routine events. I can't say it works as well as Stars Hollow, but that's partially because it's just less cozy to watch super rich kids spend money than it is watching old ladies dance at 6 a.m. Even the way Lorelai and Rory speak is intentionally rhythmic. So the show is known for rapid dialogue, to the point that scripts were apparently double the standard length. And this is intrinsic to the story world, as it's not just Lorelai and Rory who talk that way. Other characters mirror the cadence and humor patterns as well. And like the sepia-tinted intro and the over-decorated storefronts in the background, this rhythm contributes to the consistent flavor of every episode and insular nature of the world. The show is also known for packing in pop cultural references, ranging from Kafka to the Bangles, but it never really matters what references the characters are making. Sure, Lorelai is supposed to have sort of more lowbrow taste than her bookworm daughter, but she also makes literary and political references offhandedly. Rory is supposed to have this lifelong dream of being a foreign correspondent, but we wouldn't know that from the media she consumes, which ranges from Gogol and Dickens to Ginsberg and Demosthenes. It's not what she reads, it's that she reads. And it's not what they refer to, it's just that they make references. These characterization details are less for telling a narrative than they are for creating a world. The one exception is perhaps Jess Mariano, who has a distinct Beat Generation literary interest, but even then, that literary taste shrouds him in a romanticized vibe.
You've read this before.
About 40 times.
I thought you said you didn't read much.
Well, what is much? Good night, Rory.
Good night, Dodger.
The actual music of the show goes a long way in setting the tone as well.
Someday, when I'm awfully low,
The town troubadour, who is a real musician, helps make Stars Hollow a charming storybook setting, of course, and then we have the iconic la la la's during scene transition. These aren't just for the hell of it. They subconsciously reinforce the magic of this particular story world in Stars Hollow. This idea that things will go on. And I know, obviously, these little la la la's aren't trying to tell us there's some omniscient god behind the scenes, but they do contribute some broader force. Like the world itself is cradling these two women and their stories and us along with them. Like here, it's not just that Lorelai the character thinks the first snow is special. The snow is somehow truly special here. And we could go on, but the point here is that Gilmore Girls takes its time establishing the rules and routines of its heightened story world in order to make sure that we, the audience, feel comfortable as insiders. And that's one reason why the show invites rewatches. It is, through its slow emphasis on world building, literally inviting you time and time again. An invitation reinforced every episode in the opening credits to the tune of a classic Carole King banger about always being there for a friend. Sort of the show's way of saying that no matter what's going on in your life, whether you've just had a breakup or you're sick or you just moved somewhere new, Gilmore Girls and its world will always be there for you. It's pretty hard to have two equally balanced protagonists, but Gilmore Girls pulls it off thanks to its approach to plot structure, in particular two related devices, thematic parallels and points of plot intersection. You'll notice the latter all the time. A point of intersection is just any method of bringing together multiple threads of plot under one roof, sometimes literally. So Lorelai and Rory usually each have their own thing going on, sometimes Emily does too, and the perfect storytelling tool to bring it all together is the intersection device of the Friday night dinner. It's fundamental to the premise, so the writers always have a place for characters to find out about weddings, interrogate boyfriends, argue, laugh, and so on. And it's not easy to make the same four characters sitting around the same table every week interesting, but these dinners are never boring because they're integral to the organic unfolding of various subplots and character-centered storytelling. Rory brings Dean to dinner, Richard is rude to him, Emily finds out Lorelai is engaged and didn't tell her, Emily yells at Richard and demands he apologize to Rory so that history doesn't repeat itself. Multiple things coming together here. It's so simple and so genius, and none of that would have happened without the plain old Friday night dinner. But on top of those dinners, Gilmore Girls also piles on points of intersection through events, including the obvious and standard weddings, graduations, and funerals, but also otherwise mundane little parts of life like school debates, parent-teacher conferences, business dinners. They're all used strategically. And then, of course, there are the aforementioned eccentric events of Stars Hollow. For example, in one of my favorite episodes, Lorelai, Rory, Suki, and Lane each partake in the annual picnic basket blind date auction. All four of these characters have their own thing going on. Here, none of the subplots rely on each other. So Lorelai is fending off suitors and forces Luke into an adorably friendly / subtly flirty lunch. Jess outbids Dean to spend the day with Rory. Suki misunderstands Jackson, but they ultimately get engaged. And Lane spends the day running around to hide from her mom and ultimately gets dumped. These are four utterly independent threads of plot, but the commonality of the picnic date structure gives the episode a cozy, cohesive feel. And this example takes us to thematic parallelism, where multiple stories are told at once but are united in theme. Obviously, in that episode, Lorelai, Rory, Suki, and Lane are each dealing with different men or boys, but they're all figuring out love, just at wildly different stages. We see this all the time in Gilmore Girls, where Lorelai and Rory often each have some absurd boyfriend drama going on, but it's not always about love lives. One of the best scenes of the show takes place at Harvard. So Lorelai has just bailed on her wedding with Max, which was bad. We don't love how she handled that. And to distract herself, she's taken Rory to visit Harvard. We've been hearing all about Harvard for ages. Rory is super excited. And we, the audience, are sort of lulled into letting this be Rory's episode. But in a quiet moment, while Laurie sits in on a lecture, we see Lorelai stare at the portrait of the valedictorian from the year she might have graduated. It's a wordless scene, packed with meaning. And later in the episode, we're back in Stars Hollow, and Lorelai tells Suki that it's time to go for it. It's time to open up their own inn, just as they've always been dreaming. What a beautiful storytelling move. Here, again, Lorelai and Rory each have their own thing going, and absent being mother-daughter, their plots have nothing to do with each other, but their character stories have everything to do with each other. Lorelai is reminded of what could have been in her life, and it's this sad moment, but then she hears her daughter thriving in a college class, and that sadness becomes bittersweet triumph. Your dreams are right there waiting for you if you can leave the past behind and grab them. Or Season 3, Episode 17, Lorelai slowly walks through the burnt wreckage of the Independence Inn, while Rory slowly walks through her bedroom, seeing all her Harvard decorations replaced with Yale ones. 2 moments of bittersweet closure, doors closing so new, better ones can open. Particularly in the first few seasons, pretty much every episode, though, makes strong use of thematic parallels and points of intersection, and that's why so many of them often revolve around a birthday or a party or a school project or whatever. And as the show goes on, there's definitely a drop-off in both frequency and quality of these moments. For example, the notably bad episode at Martha's Vineyard, where Lorelai and Luke stay with Rory and Logan. Here we have a point of intersection, the 2 couples under the same roof, but the show weirdly sidesteps the obvious connective story here. The episode could have centered how strange it must have been for Lorelai to be visiting a version of life she was supposed to have, and for Rory to be hosting her mother in that way, but instead, they make Luke act like a total cartoonish idiot for no reason. But when these devices are working for the show, they work incredibly. At Gilmore Girls' best, every episode feels remarkably intentional when it comes to structuring a cohesive story with strong thematic identity. It might be a lighthearted comedic series, but Gilmore Girls is more than capable of packing an emotional punch, not despite its absurdly low stakes, but precisely because of them. First of all, it's worth acknowledging that particularly 20 years ago, it was pretty rare to have a show so unabashedly centering women-led stories, not just with women main characters, not just in the dreamy, romantic way the men are written, but also in the things that are taken seriously here. I mean seemingly small moments like calling your crush's house just to see who answers, feeling pretty in certain outfits, or navigating weird rivalries at school. These aren't exclusively or definitively feminine by any means, but taking these elements of life and living seriously when they're usually not shown is a project both powerful and comforting to many.
Well, who will be interested in a story of domestic struggles and joys? It doesn't have any real importance, does it?
Maybe it doesn't seem important because people don't write about them.
No, writing doesn't confer importance, it reflects it.
I don't think so. Writing them will make them more important.
In Gilmore Girls, the ostensibly small moments of life are made big, and that's a testament to both strong writing and strong acting. Lesser shows wouldn't be able to make such low-stakes drama nearly as compelling. At the surface, the narrative stakes of the show are things like someone's feelings getting hurt, not returning voicemails, ultimately minor health scares, a mediocre test grade. But by taking all these insignificant moments of life and making them dramatically significant, Gilmore Girls makes way for character-driven storytelling. None of these plot stakes ultimately matter that much. So to watch this show, you have to buy into the characters or it will seem a bit ridiculous. Like what? Are we supposed to feel bad for a hyper-wealthy white guy whose biggest problem is too much time on his hands? In Season 2, Episode 12, Richard in Stars Hollow, yeah, we are. In this episode, the newly retired Richard is driving Emily crazy, so she makes Lorelai invite him to Stars Hollow, where his constant judging leads to an argument with a pretty sad conclusion.
I never once imagined that I would go from being a productive member of the human race to a decrepit old drone sitting at the club at 3 in the afternoon drinking brandy and playing cards.
Oh, Dad.
I am an annoyance to my wife and a burden to my daughter. Suddenly, I realize what it feels like to be obsolete.
As usual, in material terms, the stakes of the show are incredibly low here, but up until now, we've seen Richard as this intensive, overbearing figure of financial and professional authority, and this scene pulls the rug out on the audience. Look at the very real vulnerability beneath all we've been shown. Here's a dimension to someone you thought you knew, and here he's giving voice to a fear that we might actually all have. So Gilmore Girls is stunningly adept at zooming in on moments of life like that and playing with its own relationship to the audience. Moments of life that, in TV, typically go unnoticed or unnamed to make way for bigger, more grand plot maneuvers. This definitely adds to its rewatch value. It's comforting to think of all those invisible moments as indeed visible, even if only in a fictional little town.
Wait! Look around for a second. You notice?
Notice what?
It's not so scary anymore.
These quick, often wordless scenes happen in almost every episode, and they're beautiful, and they work best when we get to see other sides to characters with whom we've spent quite a bit of time. Keeping the literal plot stakes low means that the show has latitude to focus instead on character work. Over time, we come to see everyone in multiple ways. With power, without it, making mistakes, or being a leader, and so on. But these low stakes also communicate to us what the show is about. There are plenty of interesting interpretations out there about what Gilmore Girls has to say about wealth and privilege, or being a working woman, or motherhood, but as we'll see in the next section as well, none of those big thematic questions are really why we're here. To quote Amy Sherman Palladino, quote, "This show is about a mother and daughter who are best friends as well as being mother-daughter, and every conflict and dynamic should tic-tac back and forth on that one point." This is the perfect insight to the show's vision, but we don't even need it. Just look back at the pilot episode, which is among one of the best pilots out there. It instructs us on how to watch this show. So the inciting incident that we've already discussed in this episode is, of course, Rory being accepted to Chilton and Lorelai realizing she doesn't have the tuition. The episode balances these two as equal leads perfectly. Lorelai absolutely does not want to go to her parents, but in seeing how excited her kid is, she reluctantly sacrifices pride and asks for support. Meanwhile, after that initial excitement, Rory meets Dean at Stars Hollow High and decides she doesn't want to go to Chilton at all. She only changes her mind when she finds out that Lorelai made that sacrifice for her. So this episode opens huge thematic topics about friendship and loyalty, romance versus independence, the power of money, how to fight for your dreams, and more, but that's not why we're here. The crux of the episode, the heart of the show, is Lorelai and Rory each recognizing their love for the other. Their dynamic, which over the seasons is loving, codependent, stubborn, adoring, complex, ever-changing, their dynamic is why we're here. And it's the core of the story infrastructure. Their journeys, one into the future and one into the past, are entirely interdependent, and each moves the other along. In other shows, characters are often purveyors of grander themes, which doesn't mean they're necessarily simple or unhuman, just that they are a means to a larger storytelling end. But in Gilmore Girls, the characters, namely Lorelai and Rory, are the ends in and of themselves. Greater themes may come into play, but only insofar as they affect those two women and their relationship. In case I'm not making any sense, here's another example. In Season 2, Episode 11, Secrets and Loans, Lorelai and Rory's house is infected with termites, and the damage is quite expensive. They even price it for us. $2,000 to tent and fumigate, another $15,000 to repair the foundation. Now, where I think some of that material criticism comes in is in how frustratingly easy it is for Lorelai to solve this problem. Though she can't get a loan herself, her wealthy mother sets up a meeting at her own bank and co-signs a loan. That's certainly annoyingly easy. In other shows, this problem would have to have had an earned solution. The payoff of fixing the house, or the pain of losing the house if not, would be the core impact. But we know by now, from the tone of the show, that nothing deeply upsetting like losing the house would ever happen. The parameters are extremely safe. The material stakes are always low, but they're low to make way for the character story in this episode. So the narrative stakes here are, as Amy directed, entirely pinpointed on the dynamic between Lorelai and Rory. Emily only knew about the termites because Rory told her against Lorelai's wishes, and that betrayal, that hurt, and how they recover from it, that's why we're here. These low plot stakes might put some viewers off, but if you can accept the show's parameters and allow yourself to get to know the characters, Gilmore Girls can be a monumentally moving show. So what makes Gilmore Girls distinct from Breaking Bad or Succession or The Sopranos? It's not choice of subject matter or tone, because it's also what makes Gilmore Girls distinct from New Girl or Parks and Rec or The Office. All of these are high-caliber shows that each have a prevailing ethos that guides their characters along dramatic pathways. They're not simple little morality fables, but they each have a core message, a core stance on humanity that helps shape the overarching structure of the main narratives. For example, New Girl, yes, very silly, lighthearted show, but the characters are always rewarded when they're unapologetically true to themselves, and they're punished when they're not. And Gilmore Girls certainly embodies certain values here and there. Forgiveness is typically depicted as a good thing, as is communication, but when it comes to an overarching ethos, wondering what Lorelai and Rory deliver to us, the answer is simply Lorelai and Rory. You'll notice in that quote from Amy that she doesn't say whether their dynamic is good or bad, it simply is. But before we get to the character arcs of Gilmore Girls, it's worth noting that the show is typically neutral when it comes to social issues and themes as well, and that's certainly a reason why it's so comforting as a watch. Gilmore Girls might need you to buy into its cozy story world for the show to work, but it doesn't demand much else of its audience. Despite how frequently it involves challenging themes, it's very unlikely to seriously challenge your worldview. As a standout example, there's a Yale-era subplot when Paris has an affair with a college professor. She's cheating on her boyfriend, which is an obvious wrong, but beyond that, the show doesn't seem to have a stance on whether her relationship with the professor is bad or not. You're perfectly able, as a viewer, to think Asher Fleming is a predatory creep, but you can also watch and think this is somehow a healthy, good relationship. Rory herself is initially grossed out, but ultimately supportive. This weird little subplot exemplifies how the show exists just sort of to exist. It doesn't need you to have any particular takeaway here. In other instances, we see competingly compelling justifications from multiple sides of any given dilemma, which is why characters who are introduced as mini-villains tend not to stay that way, like Emily, Paris, and Tristan.
Do you have pictures from back then?
I'll send you a box full tomorrow.
Thank you. What if he doesn't think I'm special anymore? How am I going to tell him I didn't get into Harvard? What am I going to do?
I'm sorry I gave you such a hard time for a while.
Oh, it's okay.
It is.
Well, no, but you're sad.
And so when I say neutral, I don't mean it in an inherently bad way. This approach to storytelling necessitates character complexity. So when, for example, the family visits Yale and Richard springs an admissions interview on Rory, we understand why Lorelai is so angry. It's obviously manipulative and controlling, but on the other hand, it's also pretty dumb to literally only apply to Harvard when you have a family connection at an equally prestigious university. And when Rory ultimately does choose Yale, it's not presented as a tragic caving in to overbearing pressure. It's triumphant, and Richard's happiness is pretty adorable. But the greatest demonstration of the show's neutrality is in longer-term character arcs, particularly the infamous decline of Rory herself. She's been described as the show's true villain, the least likable protagonist ever, and while you might not hate her as much as some internet voices do, I think for a lot of people who watched the show at a relatively young age at first, Rory was just a flawed protagonist, but still a role model, and then when you revisit from an older age with more life context from which to judge her, she is very clearly annoying, if not insufferable. This is sort of the Rory realization that I at least had. And that audience experience is in and of itself interesting. See, normally a show will have a certain way it needs you to feel about its protagonist, and if we don't feel that way, the show falters. Emily in Paris was a disaster of a show, in part because it needed us to identify with a likable lead, but they accidentally made their Emily a garbage person, and that disjuncture gets seriously in the way of the show. But here, you can absolutely watch and identify with Rory. Even in her most disastrous decision-making, we're constantly reminded of her youth, her vulnerability, how Lorelai hasn't always set the best example. But you can also absolutely watch and think she's awful. It's entirely up to you, and either way, you're not missing anything and you're not disagreeing with what the show is trying to say. Beyond our ability to watch from those different angles, there are a few other indicators of neutrality. You know, sometimes it is clear what we're supposed to feel as an audience. While you might think it's either Rory being a weak idiot or Rory demonstrating a normal reaction to life stress, when she drops out of Yale, it's clearly not a good thing in the narrative, even if it is an understandable decision. We can sense narrative disapproval through music, dramatic consequences down the road, and often the voices of insightful characters.
She is not quitting school. This was her dream. I am not going to let this happen.
I know you better than anyone. This isn't you.
I don't know.
What are you doing? Living at your grandparents' place? Being in the DAR? No, Yale. Why did you drop out of Yale?
This is a clear contrast to most of her other decisions, which typically lack that obvious narrative condemnation. Another clue towards neutrality is the perspective from which we watch the show. While Lorelai and Rory are our protagonists, we're not in their heads, and even though we get glimpses into how they're feeling here and there, particularly I think with Lorelai, they're perfectly capable of surprising the audience in their decisions. And sometimes we know what they're thinking before they realize it themselves. We are very much intentionally removed from their perspective so that we can have our own. We've been invited into their story world, we're insiders, but we aren't situated within their worldviews, so we don't have to see the world like they do. So this narrative neutrality both keeps the show a comforting, unchallenging experience and allows for well-written character and situational complexity. You know, there is no good or bad, only thinking makes it so. But I think this neutrality is also behind some of the show's worst turns. If there were some sort of prevailing ethos, if this show had a message it had to get across, it would have mattered more to the writers where each character ended up. There would have had to be a particular vision behind each arc. And as the seasons progress, it becomes clear that there really isn't one. Suki and Lane, the two nominal best friend characters, both land the same narrative fate. At the end, they're both married, with kids, settled down in Stars Hollow with utterly buffoonish husbands. But despite how cartoonish and sorta hobbity Suki and Jackson are, their story is weirdly riddled with darkness. Jackson is often pretty horrible to Suki, including a season 7 storyline where he lies about having had a vasectomy and gets her pregnant. That's marital assault, but the show doesn't really seem to care. And Lane's ending is one of the most disliked elements of the show as a whole. It's obviously a bummer to see this angsty but bright-eyed, sweet drummer girl marry an idiot, have sex once and hate it, get pregnant and that's it, the end, done. It doesn't feel like justice for this awesome character. And this ending isn't written as definitively good or definitively bad. Not even Rory has much to say about anything here. I would rather see her explore a music career, but if Lane's going to end up as a Stars Hollow mom, it would feel a bit more like narrative justice if the show had a point about how her ending goes wrong and why. It's likewise pretty sad to see Lane and Rory's friendship go from figuring out life together to catching up coldly as acquaintances. And here, again, the show could have made an interesting point about how childhood friendships fade, but instead, it's just something that happens and no one really seems to care. Then there's Luke, whose great challenge in early seasons is his inability to be emotionally vulnerable, and when he eventually gets with Lorelai, it's a narrative triumph, not just because it's been a slow burn romance and we love to see it, but also because his character had to grow to get there.
This thing we're doing here, me, you, I just want you to know I'm in. I am all in.
And then, when his surprise daughter April shows up, it's really hard to watch. It's really hard to watch Luke shut Lorelai out again, not just because it's unpleasant, but because it doesn't make any narrative cohesive sense for this character. Paris had a fantastic journey in early years. Her character had to learn that she can't control everything, and she's an important foil to Rory in that way. She even accepts that she isn't smarter or better than Rory. But then, as editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News, Paris turns into this despotic, cartoonish dictator. And even putting aside that this is a needlessly nonsensical job for a pre-med student to have, the real crime here is how she's reduced to the silliest version of her youngest self, a version that she, and we, the audience, had already well moved past. But my personal gripe is really with Emily's arc. In early seasons, Emily is confronted with just how unloved Lorelai felt as a teen, and while she remains over-controlling and sort of haughty, Emily makes great strides in ensuring history doesn't repeat itself.
You bought her Cosmo Girl.
Well, the young girls enjoy the articles.
You bought boy band posters and Hello Kitty notepads.
But then when Rory does actually live with her, Emily reverts to the same Puritan nonsense that drove Lorelai out in the first place. This part of the show is really frustrating because Emily easily could have maintained character complexity, she could have exhibited flaws and weaknesses while staying on a consistent track in a cohesive character direction. And don't get me wrong, it's not all bad, not by any means, and leave it to Kelly Bishop to make absolutely any scene special. But it's frustrating to rewatch season 1 and wonder what the point was. Gilmore Girls could so easily have had any number of core fundamental messages, and there are moments where it feels like something big is staring us right in the face, but then it's quietly swept away. For example, dozens if not hundreds of scenes ask the question of if it's possible for people from different economic backgrounds to reconcile.
No. Some workman has left his filthy truck in our clean driveway. Richard must have sent for him.
Oh, that's mine, actually. What am I doing here, Rory?
You're picking me up.
I don't belong here. This town, it's all you are, and it's not enough. She's gonna get bored, and you can't take her anywhere.
This isn't you. You going out with this jerk? With a Porsche? We made fun of guys like this.
Okay, Chavana.
I don't... Hey, don't sweat it, man. I can cover you, too.
No, thanks.
It's no big deal. I invited you. My treat.
It's okay. I just need to find an ATM. I'll be right back.
It's often the non-privileged perspective that pushes Lorelai and Rory to do better for themselves, but while the nastier sides of having wealth and privilege are often on display, this show hardly condemns those who have money.
Richard and Emily Gilmore are kind, decent, unfailingly generous people.
Great. It's been great speaking with you, too. I'll tell my father. Bye. And that's how we do it at the Daily News!
There's also a recurring theme of women's roles in the household. Emily feels dismissed and condescended to by Richard and Lorelai. Rory is scorned by Logan's family because she wants to work. And there is, of course, Dean's entire trajectory from thinking a wife cooking for a man is nice to destroying his own home life.
General idea of a wife cooking dinner for her husband and family, that's nice. Why is that not nice?
Well, will you be home for dinner? Because I was thinking of cooking or something.
I guess. I'll try. I don't know.
But as usual, the show doesn't really have a stance on this. I mean, obviously, Gilmore Girls isn't suggesting that a woman's place is in the home, but it also shows that lifestyle in a relatively sympathetic light. And that core theme, that this is a mother and daughter who are also best friends, the theme doesn't have a so what to it. The show doesn't argue that their dynamic is anything other than unique. At the start, it seems idyllic, and at other times disastrous. It is essentially neither good nor bad, but complex and loving and messy and safe. So, all in all, this show's neutrality is both a strength and a weakness. On the one hand, it can be pretty frustrating to watch the two leads being sheltered from narrative judgment. And behold, all the articles citing moments like Lorelai leaving Max or Rory cheating on all of her partners. And it's likewise frustrating that a show involving so many interesting thematic questions doesn't posit any answers to them. But on the other hand, the show's core neutrality makes it all the more inviting. There's meaning everywhere, you just have to figure it out yourself. There's obviously a lot more to say about this show, but here I've tried to focus on the elements of storytelling that are particularly strong in Gilmore Girls and that make it an enduringly rewatchable show despite its flaws. This show is a source of endless, sincere comfort to many, many people, but as we've seen, it takes well-structured and meticulously detailed story writing to create a world of comfort and care so successfully. Gilmore Girls does tend to avoid actually grappling with difficult social themes, and it does tend to sort of dress itself up as a little more serious than it actually is by evoking those themes and then retreating back to character focus. But I can forgive all of that because of how successful, even in the weird moments of later seasons, how successful the character work is. For God's sake, there's an episode when Emily pitches a fit because Lorelai doesn't want to go on a second date with John Hamm, whose mother is in Emily's social club, and somehow Emily emerges as a sympathetic character here, even though she's being absolutely ridiculous. This is the power of character-driven writing in a carefully well-established story world. And while the show doesn't provide answers to a lot of those thematic questions it asks, Gilmore Girls absolutely embraces the complexity of life in a compelling way. Sometimes friends just drift apart and it doesn't mean anything. Sometimes people behave irrationally. Sometimes we only think we've changed. And for that reason, Gilmore Girls, despite its abject eccentricities and undeniably unrealistic moments, Gilmore Girls feels like a remarkably honest slice of life, albeit a substantially privileged and cushioned one. The show's greatest strength, though, overall, is in being self-aware. It knows its world is privileged. It knows its characters are flawed.
Probably gonna tell your sister also, so she's probably gonna hate me too.
Well, too bad, Rory. Somebody doesn't like you for once.
Gilmore Girls knows exactly what it's doing, and that's all too rare in other shows of its kind. It's also worth noting the fantastic acting performances. I've already given Kelly Bishop a shout out, but she deserves another for being utterly magnificent.
Would you like another beer, Luke? Christopher? I think you'd better go now.
Emily,
Leave now. Please.
As is Edward Herrmann as Richard. The entire supporting cast is phenomenal, really, but we have to appreciate Lauren Graham as Lorelai. She brings a standout emotional depth to the goofiest of scenes, and particularly in later seasons, the writers definitely rely on her charisma for the show's humor. I will say, I think Alexis Bledel's portrayal of Rory in later years is sorta awkward. I tend to try not to blame actors for bad writing or directing, but I do think that that's a factor here. Overall, though, there's not a single miss in the casting, and it's a joy to see a cast with such strong, fluid chemistry. The coziness of the story world, the consistency of the rhythms, including the pace of sarcastic, reference-laden dialogue, and the coordinated structure of those best episodes, those low plot stakes that make the small details of main characters' lives feel as large as details of our own lives, these storytelling elements come together to create a uniquely flavored, always welcoming story experience. In fact, the way the show just lets things be without needing to convey any particular message, while it is a weakness in some ways, it also sort of puts the show in a genre of its own. And one reason why A Year in the Life felt way off was that it did insist on having messages at every turn. So even if the writing there had been better, and even if the character chemistry had remained, it still wouldn't have had that special Gilmore Girls effect. That effect is a hard thing to recreate, and I absolutely adore the show in large part because it's wrapped up in my own experience of it over the years. my opinions on certain characters have changed over the years, and since the video's almost over, I'll just say it, I hate Logan. But beyond that, I have particular memories of watching certain episodes with friends, of hearing the intro music play in the background while I make dinner. There are certain stretches of the show, namely early season 2, that will just never get old to me, and Lorelai, not despite her flaws, but because she lives with brightness and hope even with her flaws, Lorelai will always be someone whom I admire. So yeah, nostalgia is undeniably part of that Gilmore Girls effect, but that's no accident. With its blending of past and present, with its sepia tones and weekly routines and consistent background characters, this show casts life and living in unapologetic romance and significance, seeing beauty and importance in the small moments like replaying a voicemail or the first snow of winter, and to me, that's what Gilmore Girls will always be about. It's the show that will always be there when you need a friend. You know, where you lead, it will follow. Thank you as ever for watching. I hope you can forgive everything I've omitted in trying to fit 7 seasons of storytelling into one video. I love reading about people's different or similar experiences with the show, so please do comment with your thoughts. Thanks, guys.